U.S. President Donald Trump appeared on Fox News on Friday evening, where he graded his performance after the leaders of Russia and the U.S. held a summit meeting in Alaska. Asked by Sean Hannity if he had to grade the meeting on a scale of 1 to 10, Trump said, "I think the meeting was a 10. Trump emphasized that when two big powers get along, especially when they're nuclear powers, that's a big deal. Trump noted that the meeting lasted about 3 hours, calling it very extensive, and said now it's Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to get it done to end the 3.5-year-old war. Zelensky said he will meet Trump in Washington on Monday after the summit ended without an agreement to stop the fighting in Ukraine. In a reversal, only a few hours after meeting Russian President Vladimir Putin, Trump said an overall peace agreement, and not a ceasefire, was the best way to end the war. That statement echoed Putin's view that Russia is not interested in a temporary truce, and instead is seeking a long-term settlement that takes Moscow's interests into account. Trump and Ukraine's European allies had been calling for a ceasefire ahead of any negotiations.
And it was very extensive, and we agreed on a lot of points. I mean, a lot of points were agreed on. But there's not that much. There's, one or two pretty significant items, but I think they can be reached. Now it's really up to President Zelensky to get it done. And I would also say the European nations, they have to get involved a little bit. But it's up to President Zelensky. I think we are, and if they'd like, I'll be at that next meeting. They're going to set up a meeting now between President Zelensky and President Putin. And myself, I guess, I didn't ask you about it. Not that I want to be there, but I want to make sure it gets done. And we have a pretty good chance of getting it done.
If you had to grade it on a scale of 1 to 10?
So I think the meeting was a 10 in the sense that we got along great. And it's good when, two big powers get along, especially when they're nuclear powers. We're number one, they're number two in the world. And it's a big deal. That's a big deal.
Talks between the U.S. and Russia are encouraging, but it could be a long time before a deal is reached in Ukraine, said an analyst on Friday, following the Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska. According to Associated Press, Mark Kanchan, a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, told the AP that the friendly atmosphere of the summit between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin could signify a first step on what could be a long journey. Kanchan said, however, that Ukraine would now be in a tough negotiating spot, and that a complete Russian withdrawal is just not realistic, unfortunately. The concern is that the pressure will go on to Zelensky to give up territory, to make an end to the conflict and get it over with, as Trump would say, he said. Now they're in a tough spot because the Russians occupy about 16% of Ukraine. And Ukraine really has no theory of victory about how they're going to get the Russians out. The much-anticipated summit between Trump and Putin began with a warm welcome and a flyover by screaming jets at a U.S. military base in Alaska, but ended with a thud Friday after they conceded that they had failed to reach any agreements on how to end the Russia-Ukraine war. After about 2.5 hours of talks at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Anchorage, the two men appeared before reporters for what had been billed as a joint news conference. Kanchan called the press conference startling, even bizarre, as both Putin and Trump refused to take questions from journalists and ended talks hours earlier than expected. Amid drawn-out diplomatic moves to end the war, time appears to be on Putin's side. That gives a leg up to Russian forces, who have used their larger numbers to slowly grind down defenses in eastern Ukraine 3.5 years into the conflict. Putin got a pleasant reception from the leader of the free world on U.S. soil and walked away hours later without either providing details on what they discussed, whether a ceasefire was any closer to reality or what the next steps would be.
Well, the first thing is that the press conference was startling, even bizarre, in the sense that the meeting was expected to last maybe 6 hours and broke up after about 3. Then the press conference was called very abruptly. The journalists race into the room. The parties come on stage and speak their piece. Putin starts off, then Trump responds, and then they troop off. After a couple of minutes, they take no questions, and Putin gets on his airplane, flies away. And I don't think anyone quite expected a, a, a result like that. On the other hand, the words spoken were very friendly. Both Putin and Trump were encouraging about the future, but vague. And this is clearly the first step on what could be a long journey. Putin started off being very complimentary. He pointed out that there were 700 place names in Alaska that trace their roots to Russia, that there are Russian Orthodox churches in Alaska, and that, in fact, the two islands that are closest together are only about 2 miles, 4 kilometers apart. So he said that we are really brothers. He also complimented Trump. He said that the war might not have happened under Trump and that it was Biden's fault. And this is something, of course, Trump has claimed. So he was flattering Trump. And Trump, in return, was very grateful, but cautious, which was reassuring. In the sense, he starts off by saying, there's no deal until there's a deal, and that there had been very good discussions, that those would continue. There were a few issues that needed to be finished, and one big issue, he didn't say what it was. I suspect it was about territory and about territorial swaps. So, not clear what the next step is. Another encouraging thing was Trump saying that the Europeans and Ukraine, President Zelensky, had to be part of this agreement. And that had not come through quite clearly, again, about a week ago. The concern is that the pressure will go on to Zelensky to give up territory, to make an end to the conflict and get it over with, as Trump would say. The Ukrainians are very reluctant to give up territory. Now they're in a tough spot because the Russians occupy about 16% of Ukraine. They're increasing that. They think they're winning. And Ukraine really has no theory of victory about how they're going to get the Russians out. So claiming that they will only accept a complete Russian withdrawal is just not realistic, unfortunately. I think they will resist giving up any additional territory. Another thing we should keep in mind is that these negotiations can sometimes go on for a long time. The negotiations to end the wars in Korea and Vietnam went on literally for years, while the fighting also went on. So the fact that we've taken a first step is encouraging, but there are so many details to work out that it might just take a long time before there's any deal announced.